Final paper of the day is by David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson, and Gordon will be presenting.
Thanks very much, Jim and Jan, for including our paper in this great conference. And thanks also in advance to Marion Bertrand and Ed Glazer, who gave us detailed and really constructive comments on an earlier draft that we tried to take to heart in producing the version we're going to show you today. So over the last decade or so, we've come to appreciate that endemic joblessness plagues many American communities. This figure shows the change in employment rate, the number of people employed relative to the working age population between 2000 and 2019 across US commuting zones. And we see concentrated pockets of red indicating declining employment rates. Many of those areas suffering that job loss were former manufacturing regions. We now have a large body of research which discusses the role of import competition in contributing to that concentrated job loss. So in the research on the China trade shock, which David Autor and David Dorn and I have contributed to, we tried to understand what import competition has meant for local economies that are specialized in the activities that were the same as the ones in which China's export growth was concentrated. And what that work shows is that these places more exposed to trade suffered acute adverse economic consequences, declines in manufacturing employment. That wasn't such a surprise. What was more surprising is that non-manufacturing didn't pick up the slack in terms of absorbing those displaced workers, nor did we see evidence consistent with substantial outmigration. The adverse effects were strongest on low-wage workers, and we also saw in these regions greater uptake of government transfers. Those economic impacts translated into social dislocation in terms of deaths of despair, more children living in single-headed households and in child poverty. What we're going to do in this paper is revisit the China trade shock. We're taking a view that now allows us to go to what we'll call the long run, and that is out to 2019 on the eve of the COVID pandemic. Much of the earlier work focused on the 2000s or maybe a little bit into the 2010s. We're going to address three questions. First, how permanent were the adverse impacts that previous work had found? Does employment recover? Do workers ultimately leave? The answer to both of those questions is going to be no. The short run adjustment looks very much like the long run adjustment. Job loss looks like it has lasted over a couple of decade period. Second, we'll ask how the China shock compares to other major shocks, looking in particular at the impact of exposure to the decline of coal and to adjustment to the Great Recession. What we'll find are qualitative similarities among these shocks, but in particular, when we compare the China shock to the decline of coal, just much larger quantitative impacts in terms of adjustment to trade. And finally, we'll try and use our evidence to say something about the fraction of the US population, the number of regions that might have actually experienced negative declines in real income. So to set the table, it's useful to think about the timing of the China trade shock. In our review of the large literature that understands where China's export boom came from and a review of the evidence itself, we see the China trade shock as playing out in three acts. Act one is one of initiation. Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening, allowing China to begin to express its latent comparative advantage in manufacturing. Act two, one of the intensification of the shock, with the tremendous growth in exports that followed China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. And Act three, perhaps underappreciated, is the stabilization of the shock after 2010. A couple of things have contributed to this. In this figure, we're showing you import penetration of China in the US market, and you see strong increases to 2010 and then a stabilization there afterwards. In the 2010s, China has ended its period of reform-driven growth, and we're also seeing the rollback of reforms, first by Hu Jintao in 2008, and then increasingly by Xi Jinping since 2012. One may ask whether, well, did the China shock just change address, moving to neighboring Vietnam or other Southeast Asian nations? We also show you here what import penetration looks like when we add in those countries. And what you see is essentially the same pattern. Little increase in import penetration after 2010. What this means is that we can study the impacts of the shock in the last decade during a period in which it had reached close to full intensity. First item of business is to revisit the impacts of the China trade shock on employment, population, and income. We'll do so using kind of the standard difference in difference approach that the literature has taken over the past decade. There are a number of issues that come up with the application of a shift share approach, as we talked about in the first paper today, that we discuss at length in the paper, and I'm not going to mention here. What I want to highlight for you is the impacts of the China trade shock over the 2000s. Well, because of the stabilization after 2010, we'll just call the trade shock as occurring over the 2000 to 2012 period, and then look at its impact on time differences of progressively longer length, starting with the simple 1-year difference after 2002, beginning in 2000, and then looking at the full 2000 or 2001 to 2019 time difference. What I'm showing you here are impact coefficients on the China trade shock for time differences in the left on the manufacturing employment to working age population ratio, and on the right on the total employment to working age population ratio. What we see is that over the full 2000 to 2019 period, impacts that look quite similar to what they did at the midpoint. Prolonged and enduring declines in manufacturing employment with no attenuation of effects despite the stabilization of the shock. Further, the negative impacts on the total employment to population ratio that you see in the right panel also persist out to the end of the study period. To a first approximation, the primary way in which regions were adjusting to manufacturing job loss was a decline in the overall employment rate. In the paper, we look at this using several different data sources and find very similar results. Another mechanism of adjustment we might expect to kick in at some moment in time is the out-migration of labor. We spent a lot of time in the paper looking at different ways of capturing changes in population headcounts that would be consistent with such net out-migration. And what we find is that overall impacts are quite small on the population headcounts for the working age, and entirely null for older workers 40 and older, or for younger workers 25 and to 30, under 25. We do find evidence of trade-induced out-migration in the form of lower population headcounts for one age group, 25 to 39-year-olds. When we look further and divide workers according to nativity, we further find that the adverse impacts of trade shocks on labor supply seem to be concentrated on the foreign-born. In some, we do see some adjustment over the longer run in population headcounts, but it's really not a primary adjustment mechanism. What these adverse impacts, and here just showing you the map again on the left, what I opened with on the right, the projected impact of the China trade shock. So a substantial chunk of that declining employment in manufacturing regions we can tie to increased import competition from China. What that declining employment rate translates into is a larger reduction in personal income per capita in more trade-impacted regions, where we're using the BEA's measure of personal income, which includes wage and non-wage forms of labor compensation, all forms of government transfers, investment income in the form of dividends, interest, and rent, and proprietors' income. So getting us as close as possible to what is really an aggregate income per capita. We do see increased uptake of government transfers. That offsets only about 15% of the income loss, and it almost entirely takes the form of increased uptake of Social Security disability insurance, and Medicare. What that means is that the government policies that are activated by trade-induced job loss are ones that workers only get by leaving the labor force. When we then ask, what does this mean for impacts on welfare, we confront the challenge that we talked about in the first session today, is that when you do this sort of regional analysis, you can get relative impacts of a given shock on regional economies, but we can't get the absolute impact. This is the missing intercept challenge. What we can do is leverage results from quantitative general equilibrium models, which through quantitative exercises tell us what the magnitude of that missing intercept. And the consensus estimate seems to be that aggregate impacts of expanded change with of trade with China are positive, but small, on the order of 0.25%. So when we look at the trade-induced change in real income, that variation just swamps that aggregate effect. And what this suggests, taking midpoint estimates, is that you've got about 16% of the US population living in places where it looks like real incomes declined on net as a consequence of that import competition. This then raises the question of why the shocks were so long-lasting. We examine a number of hypotheses in the paper. I'll talk just about two right here, and to motivate these, I want you to focus on two of the more trade-impacted commuting zones in our sample. One is North Hickory, North Carolina, a long-standing furniture manufacturing place, and Raleigh, Cary, North Carolina, which has done a mix of manufacturing activities on the course of its history. These are two places that were highly specialized in stuff that China was good at, but other aspects of their economic structure was quite different. North Hickory began heavily specialized in manufacturing, 43% of its working age population in the sector in 2000, and with a relative scarcity of college-educated workers, less than 16% of the working age with a BA degree in 2000. Raleigh Cary looks quite different, much less specialized in manufacturing, just 17% of the working age population overall, and more than a third of its workers with a college degree. So what we might imagine then is having more skilled workers and being less specialized puts regions in a better position to adjust to concentrated job loss. To examine this, first, this dearth of human capital hypothesis, that's Ed Glazer's coining that we're borrowing for this paper. When we split the sample according to commuting zones that had higher versus lower supplies of college-educated workers, what do we see? That the job loss really is concentrated in places that began with a dearth of college-educated labor. When we further split the sample according to more or less specialized regions, something we call the reverse agglomeration hypothesis, consistent with work by Erickson, Rush, Shambaugh, and Xu, looking at the China trade shock historically, and work by Dix-Canero and Kovac in the case of Brazil, what we find is that regions that are more specialized in specific industries are more exposed to industry-specific shocks and have a harder time adjusting. Then turning to the question of, was the China shock unique? We use our same empirical approach to examine adjustment to two other shocks. One is the secular decline of coal. Coal had a good decade in the 1970s. Two oil price shocks pushed the price of coal up. But in the 1980s, what began was a 2-decade secular decline in national employment in the sector. We then look at expanding the work of Black, McInnish, and Sanders, who looked at the regional impacts of coal decline in the 1990s. You expand this out to 2019. And what do we find? Commuting zones that were more specialized in coal production and more exposed to that post-1980 shock see declines in employment rates that last a full 25 years after the shock initiates. The negative impacts remain in effect all the way out to 2019, though they become imprecisely estimated in the last decade. So that concentrated job loss, also in the case of coal, looks strongly persistent. What about outmigration in the case of coal? Well, what we see is no impact on population headcount, so no evidence of net outmigration until a full 25 years after the decline of coal begins. So it's not until we're almost 30 years out from the industry decline beginning that we begin to see regions experience what looks like net population outflows. When we look at the Great Recession, we see something that's qualitatively similar, prolonged adjustment to the shock that is never quite complete. This extends the very good work of Danny Yagan out about another 5 years in time. There are a few concerns about pre-trends here that give us some question about how well we've nailed this effect. In sum, what we find with both the coal shock and the Great Recession shock are qualitatively similar patterns of delayed adjustment and concentrated job loss, though when we're comparing coal and China, the quantitative impacts of the China shock are just much, much larger. So in closing, where does this take us? What made the scarring effects of the China shock so pronounced? And what might this teach us about other potential episodes of concentrated job loss? The most obvious thing that separates it is how large the shock was and how concentrated it was in space and time. This compares to the much more spatially diffuse impacts of automation that David Otter and David Dorn have documented in other work. A second feature of the shock, which we've just become to appreciate in part through the work of Erickson et al. That we push forward here, is how special the regions that were subject to the China shock were, with this narrow specialization in manufacturing and with a relative absence of skilled labor. What we haven't examined, and certainly deserves much more attention, are the intensifying barriers to labor mobility associated with housing, with family networks, with age and skill, which also create problems for adjustment to these concentrated shocks that may not have been present in decades past. With that, thank you very much, and I'll turn things over to Marianne and Ed.
Thanks. That was great. First discussant is Marianne Bertrand.
Thank you. Let me try to share my screen. All right. Hold on, let me try to do F5. From beginning. All right, great. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Super.
Yes, this is good. Yep.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. It's been great, and to discuss this work. You know, I don't know anything about trade. I stay away from trade papers, so that should be taken as a background. I'm probably going to say a lot of very stupid things going forward. It's a fantastic paper that builds obviously on a lot of work that the two Davids and Gordon have been doing over the years. As a labor economist that kind of grew up reading Hank Farber's work, using displaced worker surveys, I'm very much, convinced by the idea that, labor markets are not as flexible as, kind of many of our, trade models lead us to believe in. And I think the importance that reminds me of a point that I want to make sure to raise that Jason Furman in the very first paper kind of mentioned. I mean, the idea that we keep on doing cost-benefit analysis, think about climate regulation, think about the BPEA, under the assumption that we can ignore labor market effects, that the labor market will clear all the time. It's something that I think we really need to confront, and I think this line of work surely help reinforce this. Okay, so before moving to kind of my main comments, I do think it's worthwhile to kind of look at this picture because this is the long time series of kind of manufacturing employment in the US. And, historians are going to go back, when we're all dead and going to look at this, and they're going to try to put this in the context of, the Trump election and the fact that China, China raping our workers was one of the important narrative that was pushed during this election. And I think you can, if you squint, see China, but this time series kind of certainly does not resonate with the idea of this massive, sudden shock that really changed what was, the trajectory for, for manufacturing employment. So I think as economists, and I won't say much more about this, but I think we have to be very careful about the narrative that we push. I think there's, a combination of like not having been, forward enough about the downsides of trades and the idea that there will be winners and losers, but also being very careful that sometimes you find a very simple story and there's truth to it and people will grab onto it, while the core problems may not be so much, opening to China, but more the nature of the labor institutions that we have in place in the US to address those kind of shocks that any open economies will be facing. All right, so I'm going to my comments. The first two are very kind of general and would have applied to any of the papers prior to this one by the two Davids and Gordon. The focus on imports has been driving this, but obviously kind of the opening, the entry of China to the WTO was not just opening, kind of the US to import from China. It was also the opening of the US to the ability to export to China. And while I understand that, kind of exports to China were so small in relationship to the growth of imports, I don't know why we would not include exports in the default specification. There's an argument that we cannot do IV for the exports. I don't quite see why we can't do the same kind of IV as being, kind of followed in the paper. I mean, furthermore, I think that taking seriously supply chains, which a lot of the follow-up work has been trying to do, is also an important part of the narrative. I think it's kind of moving a bit more of this kind of useful analysis towards some of the more GE effects. I'm not able to evaluate this work, but some people that have looked at downstream and upstream channels, maybe suggesting that, the negative impacts that, kind of we have been accustomed to look at in your papers may not be just as, as large, especially as a lot of US firms have been able to benefit from being able to bring inputs from China at a lower cost and hence, and then to expand. The other kind of difficulty that I have is again, related to focus on imports is offshoreability and routine tasks I use as controls in these regressions. I'm not so sure why I want to think about this as controls. I mean, one could have assumed that one may have built exposure to China based on the offshoreability or the routine aspects of tasks. Second kind of general comment, and that's really just more for visual, but I like, and you talked about your analysis of the Great Recessions and the importance of like looking at the pre-trans to really understand what's going on. I would just be great to have, I think it's really easy to add just a few more years so we can see the pre-trans better on all of the pictures. There's some material in the appendix that looks at the pre-trans, but it's really much more focused on the 1990s time period, 1990s shock. And I really see value in just adding that. The reason for, kind of making the pre-trans more visually apparent, I think it's pretty clear, is that this is not like a randomized experiment, of course. And the parts of the country that get hurt are very specific, and you do a good job to try to give us, kind of controls, but doing something that would be closer to like a diff and diff rather than a cross CZ exercise would be useful. And again, you have rich set of controls, but there are others I could have imagined being using, right? So male employment, to use one example, we know there's been a very, steady trend decline in male, employment in the US, especially among the less skilled. That is not the control. Would it matter? Would it not? So I was just wondering, looking at this, whether there's alternative kind of data-driven approach for control selections when we do this analysis along the line of double lasso. All right, now kind of a bit more specifics to, to the paper. You talked about, the paper is kind of positioned as like a persistence of a shock that has basically stabilized. And, I think the pictures, kind of, to me, eyeballing it may not look as obvious as that, right? So if you look at, the post-2012 time period, eyeballing it, the time, the trend in gross in imports is not very different from what you describe as the early time period. So I think maybe there's a bit more to be done to convince ourselves that, kind of there's not a never or continuing shock for this, the same areas that were battered or over the 2000s. I'd like to know more about the correlation of like where this increase in imports in the post 2012 is going to, and where, kind of the increase in imports was during the key time period that you focus on. So is it really persistent of a past shock or stabilized shock, or is it a never-ending shock? I think there's more that one can do. All right, few more things. So the one question that, I kept on thinking about is whether this was inevitable. And again, I'm convinced that labor markets take a lot of time to, to adjust. And certainly what you push is like, yes, this was a big sudden shock and all labor markets are not, able to take them on. And there's a lot of implications. Again, think about environmental regulation, cap and trade, kind of carbon pricing, et cetera, that we would need to take into account. Now, the flip side might be that this was kind of maybe, kind of worse than it could have been, right? And I have two things I want to say on this front. One is that the China shock did not happen in a vacuum. It overlapped with the Great Recession quite a lot. And then the other part of the no is that all the developed economies that, the US may like to compare itself to did not seem to have experienced losses that were comparable, at least in the short term, to what we saw in the US, and hence likely in the longer term. And I'm going to keep on, I'm going to use the example of Germany. All right, so first on, it did not happen in a vacuum. Kind of there's one thing that we know reduces people's mobility, right? And it's housing, kind of this graph shows a very different rate of like housing of geographic mobility based on whether you are a renter or a homeowner. And certainly, as we all know, kind of this period was a period of like increases in home ownership. Again, this may be too small to be an important forces, but this is something I think the paper may want to talk a bit more about. The second thing about the Great Recession is that it was a period of like drastic increases in the unemployment rate, especially for the less skilled. A lot of these people that were displaced may have otherwise found jobs in construction. These construction jobs kind of start disappearing in the 2008. You may say, well, that's late, but remember, kind of if there is some kind of like reskilling going on or retraining, that will take some years. And we certainly know from, Davis and von Wachter work, for example, that the extent to which there are long-term losses associated with being displaced, that these long-term losses are going to be much larger if you lose your job in a recession than if you lose it in an expansion. So I think thinking maybe a bit more, and again, maybe you've done a lot of this in other papers about the particular moment and the overlap with the Great Recession, I think would be useful as we think about, was it, could it have been not as bad? Okay, before I get to Germany, I think why people are not moving is obviously a really kind of key question to your work. We know that housing mobility has been declining in the US, and we have a lot of factors that have been considered: rising home ownership, aging population, rising share of dual house earners. Also kind of a set of factors like the rising occupational licensing that may make it harder for people to leave a particular area, the high cost of housing in cities. I'm sure Ed will talk more about this. There might be other, kind of barriers to mobility that particularly focus on the populations that were impacted here, right? So if you think about kind of low income populations, especially in an environment where we don't have a strong public safety net, the value of being close to family and friends might be a really, really important substitute, right? So the other thing that may make this particular group that is being hit here particularly not mobile is a matter of negative selection, right? So going back to the first chart I started with, manufacturing employment has been declining for a very long time. It is most likely the people that are the best outside options or the first to move out and relocate. So I would assume there would be a lot of negative selection in the people that were still working in manufacturing in the early 2000s, right? So that might be something worthwhile to think about. Okay, so finally, on the was this inevitable kind of the German experience. And again, my reading, and I had to read a bit because I'm not on top of this, is that the experience for Germany, which is a country just like us that produces cars and machine tools, managed to sell, their cars and machine tools to China, and saw a big rise in exports. But, furthermore, that the evidence seemed to suggest that for those areas of Germany that were import exposed, those negative effects that you see in the US did not happen. So why was Germany different, right? So a few things on this front. What one is, and Christian Dustman recently wrote a piece I thought was really interesting as a discussion for this, and I'm going to borrow some of the things that he said. One is that Germany was already integrated in these global supply chains and made it easier for them, right? Because they are part of Europe, and that means different things. So that's important itself, because were it to happen again, things may be different as US firms, would be more integrated. Some people describe the US economy prior to China as being kind of a closed economy, and we are, likely not more that. The other thing that happened in Germany is that there was a lot of, kind of adjustment of wages inside of the hardly hit firm, right? Via some kind of wage agreements that were renegotiated between the employers and the unions of the work concept. Now, one would really think that the US labor market is more flexible than the German labor market, right? So why did we not, achieve to do this? I would conjecture that, kind of the very high level in income inequality that we have in the US, the very low stagnant wages for the less skilled might be part of the story. There's a point at which, wages going further down may just not be worth it. And the value of retirement and disability may start being very, very appealing rather than yet, another wage cut. Two more things. The German experience also suggests that firms had a greater willingness and ability to retrain their worker, right? So why the willingness? I think this may tie to issues related to corporate governance, the greater role of workers, other stakeholders, a longer term, kind of orientation to profit rather than the short-term orientation that's key in the US. So we know that family firms, locally owned firms may be more able to internalize, kind of the impact of the decisions on the broader community, right? So how much of that do we have, in the US, maybe less so than in Germany? And then beyond willingness, there's ability, right? So the evidence suggests that, a lot of retraining happened in German firms, especially those that had, kind of large apprenticeship system. In the US, we have much, much less of that. We have much lower level investment in apprenticeship program, vocational education, and worker skills. And then, kind of, finally, kind of on this point about the contrast with Germany, beyond firms' willingness to internalize these shocks, there's also obviously a very large difference between what our government is doing and what governments in, other countries like Germany have been doing. So if I just took this from the OECD. This is how much the US spends per unemployed person as a percentage of GDP. And we are, if you haven't found us, back over there, right? This is in sharp contrast with the amount of spending on the unemployed that happens in other parts of the world. This is probably a reflection of, political factors, but also maybe a reflection that the US, kind of is used to be able to clear things via labor markets and may have to change that. And again, I am not saying that active labor market policies are easy, but it's certainly true that if you don't spend any money on active labor policies, nothing is going to work. And my second to final slide, one could say,
Marianne, you need to wrap up here.
Yeah, wrapping up, we do have something, we have those trade adjustment programs that are in place. It's true that they are quite unique to people displaced by trade. What again is important to keep in mind here is that this is more kind of a political carrot than anything else, right? These TAAs get voted as a way to get enough, kind of support for trade deals. When they use as carrots, also means there are going to be commitment issues. Job losses start happening. It's not like we're going to amp up the size of these programs. Just in terms of magnitude, for the TAA that was in place in 2002, as the shock was happening, the amount of funding for training funds was $220 million. That's essentially $1,700 per displaced worker. There's not that much you're going to get out of that. All right, I'm going to wrap up. This is my final slide. I think that I used the German example to get us thinking. It's hard to do cross-country analysis. What I think the paper could, do more to inform some of these questions is kind of exploit the cross-CZ variation that they observe and tell us a bit more about what were the factors that were kind of associated with more resilience, right? Beyond the focus on, education share and, industry HHI index, the nature of firm ownership, the presence of community colleges, transportation infrastructure, firms that already had traders, all these things would be really important to look at. And I'm done. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much. Next discussant is Ed Glazer.
Thank you, Vice Provost Stock. Try to get this sharing. It's a great. It is it's a great pleasure to discuss this paper, and it raises issues that I think are deeply fascinating, not only for trade policy, but also for thinking about the overall resilience of regions. So I think I just want to start this by stipulating the China shock is large and incredibly important. And while we can certainly quibble over the exact size of the treatment effect and how to think about it, this is a very big deal, and it is a very long-lasting thing. I do think in terms of the shock's duration and understanding how to think about the exact time period of it, I think they've done as well as can possibly be done with essentially reduced form work. I think actually you need to move on to something structural to be able to think more seriously about the timing. And I certainly don't think they should do that in this paper. I also agree with them that there are other shocks that are less persistent at the regional level. But as someone who has thought about shocks that have hit regions all of my entire life, there are also plenty of shocks that are as persistent as the China shock, if not more so, right? So the decline of Rust Belt cities, particularly cities, not metropolitan areas, has lasted for 50 years or more, right? We are still responding to the shocks and transportation costs that caused Detroit to lose its erstwhile edge that came from its access to raw materials and access to the inland waterways. The Mezzogiorno region of Italy, which begins in Naples and goes south, has still not recovered from the reunification of Italy 150 years ago, right? So regional persistence is not at all a surprising thing for us. So for me, this paper is best understood. And for me, the larger question is, it's an exercise in understanding why some places are able to recover from some shocks, right? And other places are not. And that is relevant both for trade policy and for thinking about regional policies in general. It also has a deep relation to America's overall geographic sclerosis, right? So this just shows the relationship across public use microsample areas between the share of prime-age men who were not working in 1980 and the share of prime-age men who are not working in 2010, right? This is a correlation that is over 80%, and it is a coefficient that is greater than 1. There's no sense in which we should think of America post-1980 as having regions are converging in some sort of smooth way, and the poorly performing areas, it's all getting ironed out. That was the story for 120 years before then, but it's really not been the regional story since then. And in particular, when we think about the geography of the China shock, it really lines up very well with the, East America's Eastern heartland. This is the places that have the highest rate of prime-age male joblessness. These are, of course, as Gordon reminded us, the places in which opioid deaths are most common, in which suicides are ubiquitous, in which all sorts of measures of social dysfunction are going on. Some fraction of it, which is largely certainly caused by the China shock, but some fraction of this predates the China shock. So it's, it relates to the general issue of places which are dysfunctional. Now, what makes a regional shock more persistent? So regional shocks to me are often best seen as a reduction in the value of region-specific human and physical capital, right? The market value of this stuff has gone down. And this can be a very straightforward just destruction of this thing. So think about Davis and Weinstein and their classic paper on blowing up parts of Japanese cities by bombers. So that stuff looked like it got reversed within 20 years. You can have declining global demand for a commodity like coal, and this is one of the shocks that Gordon is looking at. These shocks to these coal regions are driven by various things in the energy market which are outside. You can have disease or deaths from World War I in the Württemberg region, as a recent paper of Antonio Ciccone shows us, which shows us that young men being killed off appears to have a permanent impact on the outcomes of these various places. Technology like steamships or other shocks like the opening of the Panama Canal, which famously caused the city of Valparaiso in Chile to go through a 50-year downspin, right? These are also local shocks. But probably the most common shock is that declining transportation costs, at least in terms of the post-World War II US, is that declining transportation costs reduce the value of an industry and its human and physical capital in a location. And that's at least how I'm thinking about the China shock, that because of accession to the WTO, the effective transportation cost to China declined substantially. And in a sense, this happened to all of America's older, colder cities after World War II, as former manufacturing clusters, like garment production in New York City, which was the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, faced competition from right-to-work states and lower-cost nations. Now, what has the previous literature thought about what makes shocks more or less persistent, right? Obviously, the size of the shock, both in terms of the number of the industries that are hit and whether or not the shock makes the industry totally non-tenable or just face lower wages. Obviously, that's important. Duration is more difficult to assess, right? So the duration will also presumably make some difference, right? Is there a one-time drop in transportation costs, and that requires some time for adjustment? For example, you might permanently destroy a factory with one-time shock of this nature, and it might take 15 years for the factory to fully close. Again, this need for maybe a structural model to think about that. I was not particularly interested in the comparisons of the Great Recession, for me at least, because that just seemed like a vastly more complex phenomenon, right? With the Japan shock, the comparison that Erickson will do seems like the most natural for me. And the one industry shocks with coal are interesting, but probably there needs to be more to conceptually link a transportation cost shock with a commodity price shock. Okay, now moving on to what I'm really interested in, right? So what makes place more resilient? And again, for all of us who have studied, the urban renaissance that happened after 1980, we all noticed that some areas, all of which looked like they were on the trash heap of history in 1970, right? Some areas were able to reboot themselves and some ones were not, right? And just remember, this is 1971, like the highway leaving Seattle, right? This billboard is asking the last person to leave Seattle to please turn out the lights, because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. Now, of course, Seattle came magnificently back, right? Detroit is still struggling. So one thing that is sort of a consensus thing in the literature is something like diversified worker human capital, right? Typically, this is taken to be just years of schooling, where we think about the stuff learning in schools as general and the stuff learned in the factory as specific. So it's not that they didn't have human capital in Detroit in 1972, but it was very specific to making the assembly line work, right? So measures of human capital tend to be very strong predictors of post-World War II economic success, as the work of Enrico Moretti has shown us, and population growth. And there's a strong interaction with manufacturing downturns in the sense that it was protective to having a large manufacturing base. This is often phrased in terms of something called the Schultz-Welch hypothesis, named after Ted Schultz and Finance Welch, that education is more valuable during times of stress or shock. Diversified entrepreneurial talent, right? So Ben Chinitz is writing in 1961 and noting that New York appears to be more resilient than Pittsburgh even then, right? He's arguing that this is a reflection of New York's diverse entrepreneurial talent, which is a reflection of the fact that entrepreneurship has very few barriers to entry, very weak returns to scale. And so it's a mother of entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurial human capital appears to be somewhat fungible. Clearly, the regulation of startups and new forms of employment can also stymie moves to different industries. Marianne already emphasized the employment consequences of this. And Gordon studies industrial diversity and human capital, but not so much the other two, which is fine. I'm not saying that Gordon should do anything differently in this paper, but there's a research agenda here that needs to be followed. Okay, so in terms of the second adjustment margin, so those were on the adjustment margin to new industries. The second margin is flight, right? So flight from natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina, the Dust Bowl, exodus from the Rust Belt are classic examples. Flight will always allow people to become more resilient, but not necessarily places. So in an agricultural economy, sure, because when people leave, land per capita goes up, and so do wages. In some manufacturing economies, maybe, if the capital stays put. In a service economy, it's very unclear. And the ability of people to relocate makes people more resilient. So selective outmigration of the skilled can make things worse. Durable housing should mean that local shocks are asymmetric, so that booms increase population, but busts reduce income and housing prices. So in fact, you don't have a ready migration response which just lowers population, and you will often just have these selective shocks which could easily make things worse. And again, this just shows the selective outmigration. So along the x-axis is the college graduation rate for the non-migrants, along the y-axis is the college graduation rate for migrants, and you can see that the sort of low skill parts of America really were exporting skills to a large degree, and so getting more of those people out is not necessarily a positive thing. Now, they did two interaction exercises, which I think were fabulous. I agree with Marianne that they can do more things to look for this, but a lot of the time, percent human capital, percent college graduated at the place level just carries most of the weight in these things because it's much more correlated with, it's just very highly correlated with lots of other benevolent outcomes. So I thought these were sort of fascinating. I'll just say, things that I took away from these, right? The less educated areas are kind of easy to understand. So manufacturing leaves, population remains. Some people leave the labor force altogether, that declining male labor force participation. It all seems reasonable, although I'm wondering why personal income is so steady. The more educated areas are much odder, right? Working age population falls, employment over working age population rises, and incomes increase. Is the total number of households falling, right? So do we see rising vacancies, or are workers being replaced with non-workers like retirees? Is that what's going on here? Do we have positively selected stayers? Is that why incomes are rising? So those who remain are particularly likely to have jobs and higher incomes, or those who remain actually seeing competition for their labor push up wages? This seems somewhat relevant to know about, and it seems like they could know about it in a fairly easy way. They also do the splits by specialization, non-specialization, so how agglomerated different areas are. And I thought that was great too. More specialized areas have greater declines in manufacturing, employment, greater drops in employment over population, greater drops in working age population, but less of a fall in personal income. Again, that was the sort of surprising thing, was the personal income being the odd person out. It's all compatible with the idea that diversity creates resistance to the shock, but then why are incomes more robust in less diverse areas? Questions that came to me about it is manufacturing diversity different from non-manufacturing diversity, tradables from non-tradables. And again, manufacturing versus service is never the right division. There are tradable services, non-tradable services. And tradable services are a viable substitute for manufacturing, right? As New York certainly found as it replaced finance with garments, but non-tradable services are not, right? This is the stuff that is the multiplier. And are diverse areas regrowing their pre-China shock manufacturing industries? Are these old firms or new firms, or are they moving into something else entirely? So what's missing? So I don't expect the authors to address this. They've done plenty, but there's a research agenda here around place-based vulnerability and place-based resilience. In general, high frequency annual data, which is the author's thing, does very little for me. I'm very happy to look at decadal frequencies for these questions. I would like more granular information on the industry shifts, on the growth of firms of different ages and sizes. I would love to see more about stayers versus leavers at the individual level, or possibly at the establishment level. I would like to see more about the nature of selective outmigration. And I would love to understand what's happening at the housing stock, right? The high human capital places that are shocked are the more surprising places, and they're particularly interesting. More on the regulation side, more on the entrepreneur, and more on the small firm side. Just to remind us some of the other things that we knew. So in terms of other facts at the place-based level, we knew that there's this very strong Chinitz-inspired fact that if you've got really big establishments, i.e., either more competition, or that's often been interpreted as having less entrepreneurship, right? Meaning the little establishments have more entrepreneurship per capita, right? You tend to do better in terms of employment growth. This is a fact that is incredibly well documented and has, undergone a great deal of it's true within cities, it's true across cities. There's all sorts of various natural experiment things on this. Marianne already highlighted the decline in migration, which is related to this question of geographic sclerosis. Now, in terms of the policy takeaways, the most obvious policy takeaway Marianne has already mentioned, right? We screwed up, or at least I screwed up, right? All of us who took a Pollyannish view of lowering trade barriers, good for everyone, rah, rah, got it wrong, right? The distributional consequences are serious and there were real losers and we should have planned better, okay? Done, I accept that, that's entirely true. The place-based responses are more difficult, but growing sclerosis and the rise of prime age joblessness, which is different than different income levels, right? It's something that is a real pathology in most cases, makes the cost of locational collapse more severe. Now, what does that mean for policy? Better education policies, Marianne has already mentioned. I share with her the enthusiasm for vocational training, but don't think you can just reform America's schools or somehow or other impose the German model in the US. You need to be smart about this. I mean, I'm currently flogging some sort of thing like an experimental vocational wraparound, do it on weekends, do it after school, do it on summers, so you can do an end run around the teachers' unions and their opposition to reforming schools. Targeted employment subsidies in high joblessness areas. Certainly it's a possibility and it's more justifiable than many things we've seen in the past. Rethinking regulation of entrepreneurship in new construction. So that's, I think, what I've got. Jim, do I have more time? I can't possibly have more time. I'm going to go back to the German example and talk about my ruminations on why Stuttgart was better able to deal with the downsides of China than Detroit. But Jim, I must be out of time.
Yeah, why don't we open it up for questions? So the first question I have is Austin Wilsby.
Thanks. I guess the summation that comes out of this paper is that the long shocks are tied to communities where they had high manufacturing, where they had low skill, and that had an aggregate impact, which is separate from that comes from China and is separate from the just long-term steady trend decline of manufacturing employment that Marianne showed on that picture. I guess the thing that I'm puzzled by, I was intrigued by Marianne's comparison to Germany and the question of, is this inevitable? And I guess I wonder about the comparison to Mexico, because as an aggregate phenomenon, the US manufacturing share of employment is actually quite low. And the places that are manufacturing centers with low skilled workers do not make up a very big share of the US economy, whereas they make up a very large share of the Mexican economy. So if you've got 3 or 4 times the manufacturing exposure, why was the China shock not ultimately devastating at the macro level to Mexico in a way that it seems like the paper is suggesting it was to the US? If you look at the IDB's reports of the China shock on Mexico, they say it had a negative impact, but it was of a modest size. Is that because they're less specialized in Mexico? Is that because the US has more of a safety net? So there is, in some sense, the US labor market is less mobile than in Mexico. But I just find that comparison to be odd as a macro explanation.
Thanks. Heather Boucher.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I'm interested in the answer to the question that Austin just asked. I was interested that you applied this method to coal communities, which I thought was interesting. But have you thought about what the implications could be for other economic sectors that might be affected by the transition to zero carbon emissions, like, say, automobiles or other manufacturing, cement, steel? It's a really long list of sectors that will be affected by climate change, and just wondering if you are thinking about those reallocation questions and how this what the lessons might be.
Authors, do you want to take a shot?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think David Otter was able to join us, and so let David chime in too. Well, thanks first to Marianne and Ed for a really good set of comments. Let me, since we got stuck on Germany, let's talk about Germany a little bit, which I think is super interesting.
Oh, can I get my minute back? Can I get my?
What makes Germany similar and what makes Germany different? So Marianne highlighted some really important differences in labor market institutions, and along with Ed's really good ideas about how we push this agenda forward, which is exactly what kind of arming up to do. And I totally agree that looking at things over the longer time frame and to take both the regulatory, the entrepreneurial, and the labor market institutions more seriously and understanding resilience is important. But putting that part aside, which is a big difference between Germany and the US, you've got two other really important differences over this time period. One comes from the peculiar role of Germany in the EU, being kind of running structural trade surpluses because of the way that the euro was working, whereas the US, given the reserve feature of the dollar, was sort of running structural trade deficits. So that means that you've got a nature of adjustment that's going to be biased in favor of manufacturing in the German context and biased against manufacturing in the US context. But there's another feature that's important that ties into Marianne's comments about global supply chains. And that is, in the German context, the supply chains run through manufacturing. And so the export side of the German economy that is benefiting from trade with China is largely machine tools. It's largely physical stuff. In the US, the part of the supply chain that is benefiting from trade with China is not manufacturing at all. It's technology services. That's in part why when we add in exports of manufacturing to China, it changes absolutely nothing. The real action is on the much harder to measure export of technology services, which ends up locked in patent boxes in Ireland and other places. And there are real and substantial regional benefits from that. They're just not in the places that we're producing the labor-intensive goods that China was producing. And so there are a bunch of really good discussion here about how we advance this. I'm not going to talk about that. I do want to say one thing about housing and one thing about Mexico. Since we're making comparisons on Austin's point about what makes Mexico different, you do see adverse impacts of the China shock on the places in Mexico that were specialized in labor-intensive manufacturing. Mexico, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and Thailand were among the most exposed countries to the China trade shock, given their pattern of comparative advantage. What made Mexico different is that at the same time the China shock was wiping out labor-intensive manufacturing in the country, the expansion of the aerospace, automobile, and medical device production chains in the country took up the slack. As is different from Germany and the US, where labor-intensive manufacturing and capital-intensive manufacturing are in different places, in the Mexican context, they're all in the north. And so what this meant was that the places, the south in Mexico is just not in the game at all when it comes to this. And so NAFTA, in some sense, came to the rescue for Mexican regions. On the Great Recession thing and how that and the masking effects, which Eric Hurst and co-authors have examined in other work, important thing to keep in mind is that the China shock reasons were one because of that declining housing demand that Ed alluded to, avoided the subprime mortgage boom. We saw much lower price appreciation in regions subject to the China shock in the early 2000s. And so that means that the post-2006 collapse in construction just didn't matter very much for these places. Now, there's lots of other stuff going on that could have made the Great Recession an important factor in the nature in which adjustment was happening. That shutdown of credit is an important vehicle. I mentioned earlier this morning the Davis and Halterwanger idea that as you depress housing market values, you also depress entrepreneurial capital for startup firms, which can be part of the story too. So thanks for those really good comments. David had some important family matters to address today. I don't know if he's able to join us. If he is, I'll let him jump in right now. If not, free to take some other questions or to follow your lead, Jim.
Well, given that that's not the case, maybe let me jump in, Gordon,
there we
the
go.
other David.
Great.
So I'm definitely also interested to hear Ed Glazer's point on Stuttgart that I'm very interested in. Let me just briefly say that in a few weeks, the IFS Deaton report in London will release a chapter on trade that I'm working on with a colleague at the IFS, where we discuss in great detail these international differences between the impacts of trade shocks on the US and different European countries. And let me just point out two things. One is clearly that the element of exporting to China just varies greatly across countries. There is much more variation in exporting to China than in importing from China. And so Germany or Switzerland are countries among the few Western countries that have a relatively balanced trade balance with China. Many other countries like the United Kingdom look exactly like the United States. The other thing that's also important to realize is when you look at the labor market impacts in terms of employment per unit of a trade shock, then the US does not look especially bad. There are some European countries like Spain where these employment effects are much, much more negative. So in that sense, I would say a lot of these insights that Gordon described here, to some extent also translate to Europe. And we tried in that chapter that is still embargoed to get some sense at what could cross-country elements be that explain this difference, like flexibility of labor market institutions, initial industrial specialization in exporting to China. And some of these have some traction, but to be honest, I'm not sure that we were able to sort of fully nail all these differences.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess I just have a quick comment following up on Heather's point. I think that you probably have the technology. This would require some work, but you'd have the technology to construct a energy transition shock, just like you've constructed your China shocks. And it's going to be a sequence over time with regional specificity. It would require some effort, but then I think you could just ask, like, what if you hit your system with that and just see how that plays out, assuming that our policy responses are equally, about the same.
So just quickly on that point, sorry for not getting to Heather's point there. As it so happens, I have a grant proposal in to do exactly that. Very interested in both learning from earlier shocks and then ongoing shocks and trying to understand the dimensions of and elements of resilience.
That's great. That sounds really interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much for a great session, and I'd like to thank all of the authors and all the discussants for a great session. Thank Brookings for all of the work on this technology side. Hao-En Chen in particular is a hero, and she keeps Jan and me, on the straight and narrow, and we really are grateful for Brookings and their staff. For March of 2022, we are planning on an in-person conference on the 24th and 25th in DC. So back to our 2-day format, a Thursday afternoon and a Friday morning. Will require the current expectation, I should say, is it will require proof of vaccination, that sort of thing, have some hybrid capacity. All of this, of course, is to be determined following CDC, District of Columbia guidelines, et cetera, but I can hardly wait to be back in person with this really fantastic group of scholars who are committed to serious policy economics. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.